starting to build these instruments years and years ago, think that this is what it would come to?
No, in fact, we didn't think much of anything. Everything we did for fun of it.
Yeah.
Had no idea where it would go.
Right, because obviously your pioneering work in this has produced this whole field of music. Do you think that the fun is still there for people, or?
Yeah, it's different now.
Mm.
Back then you could do hardware on the kitchen table. Now it's much harder, but you can do software on the kitchen table.
Right.
But back then, in the late 60s, this sort of equipment was not even considered musical instrument. It was considered professional audio equipment that you would use in a studio.
What made you change? What made you think, hang on a minute, there's an instrument here, not just a piece of audio equipment?
Well, it was the musicians who thought about it. No one in particular at that time. There were several dozen, maybe 100 musicians who said, you know, we really like something that we can carry around and play on the gig.
Mm-hmm.
I said, play? You know, this is studio equipment. No, we want something, you know, it's got a keyboard. We want something that we can set up and do a 3-hour session with and walk out with.
Right.
That was the beginning of the Mini Moog. And once we designed the Mini Moog, we decided to try and show it at the Music Merchants Convention. That was a bit strange for those music merchants back then. None of them thought that stuff like this with knobs and patch chords and words like oscillator and envelope, you know, would sell to musicians.
Right.
I mean, they didn't understand it. How could the musicians understand it? Right. But the musicians understood it right fast, and from that the music merchants learned.
Walter Carlos and Switched On Bach obviously was a very, very important moment in your and Synthesizer's
It certainly was.
career. I've always had a feeling, in a way, that because of his incredible musicianship, he planted the seed in people's minds that the synthesizers in that time, in the mid-60s, could do far more than they actually could do. Were you aware of this? When Switched On Bach came out and the reception it got, did you think, oh my God, you know, now I've got to build what people think I've already built, or what was your reaction?
That's not exactly the way we thought about it. We recognized that Carlos had a unique talent, and the music that came out was a result of his unique talent, and the instrument was just a tool for manifesting that talent. Other musicians had talents too, but in different directions. What happened in the 60s, 69 and 70s is that a lot of other music producers figured, well, Carlos was successful and Carlos used a synthesizer, therefore the synthesizer is the gimmick. And if I get a synthesizer too, I can be as successful as Carlos. You'd be surprised how many music producers thought that, how many records were put out in the late 60s, Moog this, Moog that, and most of them flopped because the talent wasn't there, the vision wasn't there, and just the chops, the knowledge of how to use a system like that wasn't there.
How did musicians respond to this baby over here? This is,
well,
were they completely confused by it, or what?
Every musician responded differently.
Yeah.
Someone like Carlos would look at this and immediately understand what to do. His hands would be going and turning the knobs even before he touched them. Other musicians would go like this. And they'd freeze, you know, they'd freak out. And then there were all kinds of musicians in between that were intimidated at first, but they dug in. But what you find in general is that every knob on this has some musical meaning. You begin to think of changing sounds. Here's a sound, and a knob like this now would turn up vibrato. Now that's something you can hear. You don't have to study an engineering book to hear that. This knob here would change the speed of the vibrato. This whole device you think of as a device that creates a vibrato. It happens to be called a modulating oscillator. Modulation means to vary rapidly. Here's a device called a filter. This is a device that lets through certain harmonics and cuts out others. And if I were to open the filter a little bit, you can hear more and more of the harmonics. So this knob, too, has an effect on the sound that is 100% musical. And you just get to know what that knob does, and after a short time, you begin to reach for it instinctively. Our first customers were experimental musicians in universities and in private studios. The next group of musicians to adopt the use of a system like this were the commercial music producers. And what they found was that they could, for the first time, they could take a sound and tailor it anywhere in the spectrum, from a completely conventional sound that sounded like a violin to something completely freaky and new, or anywhere in between. You know, they could impart just the right degree of humor or strangeness or familiarity to it.
What year would this have been built?
This looks like several years. It could have been as early as 1967 and as late as 1977.
So you would have actually built part of this?
I wouldn't be surprised.